Most people imagine the ancient world as a series of neat empires and famous kingdoms, each one marching through history in orderly succession. But the truth is far more intricate and, perhaps, far more fragile than that. Hidden within the Bronze Age Mediterranean lies a civilization so refined, so artistically sophisticated, that it makes many of the peoples who came after seem, by comparison, almost provincial. This is the story of the Minoans, a culture that rose from the limestone and olive groves of Crete to become the dominant force of their world, only to be erased from memory so completely that we nearly forgot they had ever existed at all. Their name itself is not their own. Modern scholars gave them that identity, drawing it from the legendary King Minos of Greek mythology, a figure so ancient that even the classical Greeks could barely distinguish him from myth. But before we meet the Minoans themselves, before we understand who they were and how they lived, we must first travel to a threshold moment, a place suspended between the known and the unknown. Picture, if you will, the coastline of Crete at the very first light of morning. The Aegean Sea lies still and silver, its surface barely disturbed by the gentlest of winds. Above, the sky is transforming from the deep indigo of night into those soft gradations that precede the sun, pale lavender, then cream, then the faintest blush of coral along the horizon. The air carries the salt memory of the sea, mingled with something earthier, something green. Across the terraced slopes that descend toward the shore, olive groves stretch in silvery silence, their ancient trees twisted and gnarled by centuries of wind and sun. A thin mist rises from the earth itself, drawn upward by the slow warming of the land, and it clings to the landscape like a veil that has not yet been lifted. In this hush, in this liminal hour, when the world seems to be holding its breath, we stand at the threshold of something remarkable. For on this island, in this particular corner of the ancient world, a civilization took root that would fundamentally alter what humans believed was possible. They did not build empires through the force of armies or the terror of conquest. They built something far more enduring, a culture that shaped every aspect of life, from the smallest household ritual to the grandest maritime ambition. They were traders and artists, priests and priestesses, merchants and craftspeople, who understood something essential about beauty and proportion that many civilizations have never quite grasped. Yet their story nearly vanished. The ancient Greeks who came after them knew only fragments and legends. The classical world barely remembered them. By the time the modern age dawned, the Minoans had become little more than whispers in a few old texts, half-buried references in myths about impossible creatures and labyrinthine palaces. It took the determination of 20th-century archaeologists to excavate them from beneath the earth and restore them to our understanding. And woven through their entire existence, from their first settlements on Crete's peaceful shores to the height of their power, is a thread of geological fate that they could never have foreseen. Beneath the waters not far from their greatest cities, a volcano was slowly, patiently gathering its strength. That volcano would ultimately reshape the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, would bring to an end one of humanity's most beautiful and sophisticated civilizations, and would do so in a matter of hours. If you find yourself drawn to the mysteries of ancient worlds, to the stories of peoples who were lost and then rediscovered, and to the profound ways that natural forces can reshape human destiny, I encourage you to subscribe for the complete journey through this ancient world. What we are about to explore together is not merely the tale of a forgotten civilization, but the full story of how the Minoans rose, how they created one of the Bronze Age's greatest achievements, and how a volcano brought their entire world to an end. The complete account of this extraordinary history, from the first settlers who glimpsed Crete's potential to the moment when ash darkened the sky and changed everything, that full exploration awaits. But for now, let us begin in that misty dawn, with Crete still quiet and unsuspecting, and trace the slow unfolding of a people who would, for nearly 2,000 years, command the respect and the trade of the ancient Mediterranean world. The story begins not with kings or palaces, but with much humbler arrivals. Imagine the very earliest people to settle this island. Not the sophisticated Minoans we associate with frescoed walls and ritual priestesses, but the Neolithic farmers who came long before. These were people whose roots lay in Anatolia and the Near East, peoples who had already discovered the revolutionary possibility of agriculture. They brought with them seeds and animals, the knowledge of how to coax food from the earth, rather than only hunting and gathering it. When they first arrived on Crete's shores, perhaps 7,000 years before the Minoans would build their great palaces, the island presented itself as an opportunity. Here were fertile valleys, reliable rainfall in the winter months, slopes that could be terraced for grain and grapevines. Here were harbors that faced outward toward the wider world. For thousands of years, these Neolithic peoples lived on Crete without the monuments or the elaborate social hierarchies that we now associate with civilization. They built simple dwellings of stone and mud brick. They cultivated wheat and barley, olives and grapes. They raised sheep and goats across the rolling hills. They made pottery, simple at first, then gradually more refined, decorated with patterns that suggest both practical purpose and an emerging aesthetic sense. They created tools and traded with their neighbors on the nearby islands and mainland. There was no palace yet. There was no unified state, no complex bureaucracy, but there was, already, a foundation. And as the centuries accumulated, this foundation grew deeper and richer. By around 3000 BCE, as the Bronze Age was beginning elsewhere in the Mediterranean world, Crete was entering a period of increasing sophistication. Settlements grew larger, craft production became more specialized. The simple pottery of the Neolithic began to evolve into something more refined. Vessels with finer clay, more elegant proportions, more ambitious decoration. Metalworking arrived, bringing with it the technology to work copper and, eventually, to create bronze by combining copper with tin. Bronze brought sharper tools, stronger weapons, more impressive status objects. It brought, in other words, the material foundation for a more complex society. But the real transformation would come around 2000 BCE, or perhaps slightly before. It came not gradually, but in what seems, from our archaeological vantage point, almost like a sudden crystallization. Across Crete, in several different locations, grand structures began to rise. These were not the houses of individual chiefs or local strongmen, but something far more elaborate: palace complexes, ritual centers, administrative hubs that would come to define what we now understand as Minoan civilization. The first and greatest of these rose at Knossos, in the northern part of the island. Others emerged at Phaistos, to the south, and at Malia, to the east. Each of these centers appears to have ruled a distinct region of Crete, each commanding its own territory and port, each developing its own character while remaining part of a broader cultural commonwealth. And in that moment, in the rising of these palaces from the limestone foundations, the Minoans were born. If you find yourself drawn to the whispered mysteries of vanished worlds, if you wonder about the civilizations that rose and fell before the classical Greeks ever built their temples, then the full arc of the Minoan story, from the first farmers who saw promise in Crete's rocky soil to the moment a volcano reshaped the entire Mediterranean, deserves your attention. And there is much more to tell than what we can explore in this single evening's journey. The doorways into Minoan life open in many directions at once. The trade routes that connected them to distant shores, the intricate symbolism woven through their art, the whispered voices of their gods and goddesses in the mountain peaks and sacred grottos, the human dramas unfolding in crowded marketplaces and quiet homes. If you'd like to follow this journey all the way through, from the mist-wrapped beaches where their story begins, to the ash-choked afternoon when it nearly ends, subscribe so that you don't miss any part of the Minoan world as it slowly unfolds before us. There is no rush. The night is long, and the story has waited thousands of years. We can take our time discovering how these remarkable people lived, what they created, how they understood the sacred, and what happened on that fateful day when the earth itself rose up and changed everything. The Minoans left us fewer words than we would like. Their script remains largely unread, a tantalizing silence, but they left us images, paintings, and pottery, and the remains of magnificent palaces that speak across millennia of sophistication, of grace, of a society quite unlike anything that came after. To understand them is to understand something essential about human resilience, human artistry, and the precarious dance between ourselves and the forces that shape our world. Now then, let us begin at the beginning. Picture, if you will, the island of Crete as it emerged from the mists of the Neolithic world, long before the palaces rose. Before the palaces rose, before the great halls filled with color and ceremony, Crete itself had already lived for thousands of years in a different shape, under a different sky. The island that would one day birth an entire civilization began, as all places do, simply as geography, as stone and soil responding to the patient work of wind and water and the slow turning of seasons. Picture Crete as it lay in the eastern Mediterranean, a long, narrow island stretching east to west like a spine, like something that had broken off from the greater body of Greece and drifted into its own world. Mountains run the length of it, white limestone peaks that catch the light at dawn and hold the snow through winter in their high passes. These mountains are not gentle slopes that fade gradually into the sea. They drop precipitously, creating vast gorges and ravines that cut deep into the island's heart. Canyons so narrow and severe that they shape the way people would move across the landscape for millennia to come. A traveler moving west to east would find themselves constantly choosing, follow the coast, where it exists, or climb inland and cross the rocky spine, where the paths are ancient and worn. The climate of Crete in prehistory was not so different from what it is today, though the world around it has changed considerably. The island sits far enough south that it catches the warmth of Africa, yet it is bathed also in the cooler winds that sweep down from the north across the Aegean. Summers are dry and punishing, the sea a deep, almost metallic blue under a relentless sun. Winters are mild by northern standards, yet wet, bringing rain and sometimes snow to the highest peaks. Spring is brief but extraordinary, a sudden explosion of wildflowers and blossoms that transforms the brown earth into color almost overnight. This rhythm of wet and dry, this cycle of dormancy and sudden growth, would become the heartbeat of every human settlement that took root here. What kind of people first arrived on these shores, and when precisely they came, remains one of those mysteries that archaeology approaches with measured caution. The earliest evidence we have suggests that sometime around 9,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier, during what we call the Neolithic period, the age of polished stone tools, and the first domesticated animals, small groups of farmers and herders made their way to Crete's coasts. Where exactly they departed from, whether they came from Anatolia to the east, or from the Peloponnese to the north, or perhaps even from further afield, we cannot say with absolute certainty. But what we can piece together from the fragments they left behind tells a story of people who understood the sea well enough to cross it in small boats, carrying with them seeds and livestock and the knowledge of how to reshape a landscape to suit their needs. These early Neolithic settlers did not arrive to find a virgin wilderness. Crete already had its own creatures, wild goats, boar, and small deer that had evolved in isolation. They found forests of cypress and pine covering the lower slopes, olive trees growing wild in scattered groves, and the Mediterranean scrubland that still clings to the rocky plateaus. The sea around them teemed with fish and shellfish, and the shallow bays offered natural harbors where small boats could be drawn ashore. A person skilled in observation, standing on one of those ancient beaches, would have recognized immediately that this island possessed everything necessary for a permanent settlement: fresh water from mountain springs, soil deep enough for grain, stone in abundance, and the sea as both provider and highway. The earliest Neolithic farmers seem to have chosen their settlement sites with care, often returning to the same locations generation after generation. They built small villages of simple mud brick structures, low-roofed dwellings that huddled together for protection and shared warmth. Near Knossos, where the greatest palace would eventually rise, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of one such settlement, dating back 8,000 years or more. The people who lived there left behind pottery, crude, undecorated, but shaped with intention. They left fragments of millstones used to grind grain, flint tools carefully knapped to sharp edges, and the bones of sheep and goats whose domesticated herds they tended across the hillsides. These early Cretans were farmers, yes, but theirs was not an agriculture that demanded the complete transformation of the landscape. They practiced something closer to cultivation alongside gathering, planting barley and wheat in the terraced fields and flat valleys, gathering almonds and figs from trees that grew wild, hunting the wild boar and deer when the opportunity arose, fishing in the bays and deeper waters offshore. The relationship between these people and their environment seems to have been one of negotiation rather than domination, a kind of careful dialogue in which humans added their own patterns to the patterns already present in the land. One might wonder what daily life felt like for these Neolithic inhabitants, how different or familiar it might seem to us across those enormous gulfs of time. They would have risen with the sun, as humans without artificial light necessarily must. They would have tended their crops and their animals, repaired their tools and their houses, and gathered in the evenings to share food and the warmth of fire. Women and men both participated in the essential work of survival, though we can only speculate about the precise divisions of labor that evolved. Pottery found at these sites, decorated with simple patterns of lines and dots, suggests the beginnings of aesthetic life, an impulse to beauty that emerges even in the midst of daily necessity. The centuries of this early Neolithic period stretched on, generation giving way to generation, each one living out their lives in ways that were probably more similar to their parents' lives than any century in recorded history has been to the one before it. Yet all the while, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the settlements grew slightly larger. New areas of the island were occupied. The techniques of farming became more refined. The pottery improved. The tools became more sophisticated. People learned not just how to survive on Crete, but how to thrive there, how to read its seasons and rhythms, and work within them. And through all of this long stretch of time, something was building beneath the surface. Not just cultural knowledge and accumulated skill, but the conditions that would eventually allow for something unprecedented in the Mediterranean world. The population slowly increased. Trade networks began to form, tentative connections with other islands and distant coasts. The tools and techniques of farming became more efficient, producing surplus enough that not everyone had to spend every day simply feeding themselves. And when there is surplus, when there is time beyond the immediate demands of survival, then something else becomes possible. Then people can gather in larger numbers in one place. Then specialists can emerge, potters, craftspeople, traders. Then the seeds of something grander can take root. But all of that lay still in the future, separated from these early Neolithic farmers by 1,000 years or more. For now, they remained what they were, a scattered, modest population, living lightly on the land, drawing their sustenance from the sea and the soil, slowly learning the particular nature of their island home. The mountains above them were still untouched by the great structures that would one day rise at their feet. The harbors were still empty of the trading ships that would one day dock at their shores. Crete remained for now what it had been for millennia, a quiet island, a place apart, waiting for the currents of history to carry something new toward its shores. Around 2,000 years before the Common Era, something shifted in the rhythm of life across Crete. The scattered farming villages that had flourished for thousands of years in the island's river valleys and gentle plains began to experience a profound transformation. New kinds of structures appeared, not the modest homes of farmers and shepherds, but something altogether grander in ambition and complexity. These were the palaces, and in their emergence lay the birth of what we now call Minoan civilization. The first palaces rose at 3 principal locations, each positioned as though the ancient Cretans understood something about the balance of power and commerce across their island. At Knossos, in the northern regions where the Kyratos River spreads its fertile basin, the earliest palace structures began to take shape. To the south, In the Masara plain, where the earth runs rich and dark, Phaistos emerged as a second great center. And along the northern coast, not far from the sea itself, Malia claimed its position as a third pillar of this nascent civilization. These were not the work of a single season, nor even a single generation. The archaeological record shows us layer upon layer, reconstruction following destruction, adaptation and expansion across centuries. Yet their appearance, in this period around 2000 BCE, marks something undeniable. The moment when Crete crossed a threshold from the Neolithic world into something new, something we might recognize as a distinct civilization. What drew people to build such structures? The question rests at the heart of understanding what happened. The palaces were not defensive fortifications, and this itself tells us something profound about the world the Minoans inhabited. There were no high walls, no towers positioned for archers or spearsmen, no narrow gates designed to resist siege. Instead, the palaces opened themselves to the landscape, with courtyards at their center, often quite large and unfortified. This suggests a people who felt secure within their island, who anticipated trade rather than invasion, who imagined that their strength lay not in military might, but in something else, perhaps in the control of resources, the orchestration of commerce, the command of ritual and religious practice. The architecture itself reveals how the ancients conceived of space and authority. The palace at Knossos, which would eventually become the largest and most elaborate of the three, covered an area of some 13,000 square meters. To walk through such a space would have been to move through a labyrinth of corridors, stairways both grand and modest, storage rooms of overwhelming proportions, and chambers that scholars still debate the purposes of. Some areas appear to have been administrative, with records kept and decisions made. Others seem clearly to have been sacred spaces, shrines where ritual objects were stored or ceremonies conducted. And then there were the storage magazines, long narrow rooms stacked with large ceramic vessels called pithoi, capable of holding enormous quantities of grain, oil, and wine. These were not mere decorative structures. They were engines of economic power, and their very prominence in the palace architecture reveals what the Minoan elite valued. The building technique itself was distinctive and remarkably sophisticated. The Minoans used a combination of stone foundations and timber frames, with walls of rubble or stone bound together with clay. The timber, drawn from the cypress and cedar forests that still clothed parts of Crete, served a structural purpose, but also an aesthetic one. Those wooden beams, left exposed as part of the design, created a visual rhythm across the walls, and provided both flexibility and strength against the earthquakes that would prove to be recurring challenges on this geologically active island. In the interior spaces, especially in the grander chambers and shrines, the walls were often covered with plaster and then painted with frescoes, scenes of nature, of ritual, of the divine, rendered in colors so vivid that we still cannot fully explain the chemistry by which they were produced and preserved. But that is a meditation for another moment in our exploration. What made these palaces possible? Fundamentally, it was the productive capacity of Crete itself. The island's climate, moderated by the surrounding sea, allowed for the cultivation of the three great staples of Mediterranean agriculture: wheat and barley for bread, the olive for oil, and the grapevine for wine. When the harvest was reliable, as it often was, a surplus emerged. This surplus could be stored in those great magazines, could be taxed or collected, could be redistributed or traded. It could support specialists. Not everyone needed to farm, which meant some could be craftspeople, artists, priests, administrators, sailors. And it could fund the labor, the materials, and the sustained effort required to build and maintain such monumental structures. The palaces, in other words, were not separate from the agricultural rhythms of Crete. They grew from them, were nourished by them, and in turn, they shaped and controlled the very systems that had made them possible. The emergence of the palaces also suggests the emergence of a centralized authority. Who decided to build these structures? Who commanded the resources and the labor necessary to realize such ambitious visions? The archaeological evidence suggests that kingship or queenship, or perhaps something more akin to a powerful priesthood claiming divine sanction, emerged during this period. Whether we should think of these as kings in the sense that later Greek history would understand them remains an open question. The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous, which is partly why the Minoan civilization continues to captivate and mystify us. There are no great monumental inscriptions proclaiming the deeds of a named ruler, no obvious royal tombs with the lavish burials one might expect. What we have instead is the implication of power, the suggestion of authority in the scale and sophistication of what was built. The people who benefited most from this new order, the administrators, the priests, the wealthy merchants and landholders, began to distinguish themselves through the objects they possessed and displayed. Finely crafted pottery, imported goods from distant lands, ornaments of precious stone and metal, adorned their persons and their chambers. There is a sense, tangible even across the millennia, of an emerging elite, separate in their consumption and their concerns from the farmers and shepherds, who still constituted the vast majority of the population. Yet, and this seems significant, even this elite remained embedded within the community. The palaces were not isolated fortresses. They appear to have functioned as centers of ceremony and commerce, places where the broader population gathered for festivals, for markets, for religious observances. The separation was real, but it was not absolute. The fabric that held this emerging civilization together was complex and multifaceted. The dating of these earliest palaces, around 2000 BCE, is not arbitrary. Scholars have worked to establish this date through a combination of archaeological methods, the study of pottery styles that changed in identifiable ways over time, the analysis of ash layers that tell us when volcanic eruptions occurred, the occasional synchronization with datable events recorded in Egyptian or Near Eastern sources. What happened at this moment, at the very beginning of the second millennium before the Common Era, to trigger such a transformation? Climate may have played a role. Geological evidence suggests that this was a period of relative climatic stability in the Mediterranean, allowing agriculture to flourish and populations to grow. Trade networks that had been developing gradually seem to have intensified and formalized, linking Crete to Egypt, to the Levantine coast, to Anatolia, and to the various islands of the Aegean. With increased contact came increased wealth, and with wealth came the possibility of monumental architecture and institutional complexity. And so the Minoan civilization, as we know it, was born not from conquest or invasion, but from internal development, from the gradual accumulation of agricultural surplus, the slow crystallization of authority and ritual, the widening of commercial networks, and the human impulse to build something lasting and grand. The palaces rose, tier upon tier, corridor upon corridor, accumulating art and treasure and the weight of human aspiration. They would endure for centuries, would be destroyed and rebuilt, would become centers of a thalassocratic power that stretched across the sea. But that is a story that waits in the hours ahead. Within those palace walls and the settlements that spiraled outward around them, there existed a society far more ordered and hierarchical than the free-spirited image sometimes painted by modern minds. The Minoans, at the height of their prosperity, had developed something quite remarkable for the Bronze Age, a complex social structure that neither enslaved the masses entirely nor left them to chance. Archaeologists, in their patient examination of pottery fragments, seal stones, and the faint impressions left in clay, have pieced together a picture of a civilization organized into discernible classes, each with its own responsibilities and rewards. At the apex, naturally, rested the palace elites, the priest kings or priestess queens, whose names we shall never know, whose faces remain eternally turned away. Below them emerged what we might call an administrative class, scribes and overseers who kept records in that curious undeciphered script called Linear A, tracking everything from stored grain to textile production to the movement of goods into and out of the palace storerooms. These were people who wielded a different sort of power, not the ceremonial authority of ritual and sacrifice, but the quieter, steadier influence of those who know exactly what resources are where, and who owes what to whom. How much of their authority derived from competence rather than birth remains one of those questions that slip through the fingers of time. Below them spread the merchant class and skilled artisans, the potters and stoneworkers and metalworkers whose hands shaped the goods that would be traded across the sea, the merchants whose ships connected Crete to Egypt and the Levantine coast and the islands of the Aegean. These were prosperous people, evidenced by the quality of their homes and possessions, yet they remained ultimately dependent on the palace's protection and its control of maritime routes. There existed, it seems, a certain patronage structure, a web of obligation that bound economic activity to the authority at the center. The palace did not merely levy taxes, it orchestrated the entire rhythm of production and exchange. Then came the farmers and herders, the vast majority of the population, whose labor in the fields and olive groves and pastureland sustained everything above them. And yet, and here is where the Minoan world diverges interestingly from some of its Bronze Age contemporaries, these people appear not to have been outright slaves or wholly dispossessed. The evidence suggests a more graduated system of obligation and benefit, a society structured around reciprocal relationships and shared vulnerability to the forces of nature. The palace collected surplus, yes, but it also stored grain against famine, redistributed goods in times of hardship, and maintained the irrigation systems and terracing that made agriculture possible on Crete's rocky slopes. The agricultural calendar shaped everything about Minoan life in ways that modern minds, divorced from the cycle of seasons as we are, can scarcely grasp. Wheat and barley formed the backbone of subsistence, planted in autumn when the rains returned, and harvested by early summer. The Cretan climate, with its hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, allowed this rhythm to persist for millennia. Olives, which require years of patience before a tree reaches productivity, were cultivated with an understanding that the investment was generational, that one planted for grandchildren one would never meet. Vines clung to the hillsides, their grapes destined for wine and raisins, a crop that stored well and traveled well, making it ideal for trade. Pulses, lentils, chickpeas, beans grew in the spaces between, providing essential protein and nitrogen to rest the soil. And in the pastures and mountains, goats and sheep grazed, providing wool and milk and cheese and meat, creatures that required attention but demanded less intensive labor than grain cultivation. This diversified approach to food production had an important effect on Minoan resilience. A crop failure in one sector did not necessarily spell catastrophe. The palace's role as storage and redistribution hub took on heightened importance during lean years, strengthening both its authority and its claim to a portion of surplus in good years. It was, in essence, a form of insurance maintained by centralized power, and most people seemed to accept its necessity. Yet the true transformation of Minoan society, the engine that drove its prosperity and gave it reach far beyond the island itself, emerged from the sea. Crete sits at a geographical crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean, close enough to Egypt to make trade feasible, positioned between the Cycladic Islands and the Anatolian coast, ideally placed to become a hub of maritime commerce. The Minoans, over generations, developed a merchant fleet that became legendary, ships that sailed with clay pots filled with wine and oil, bringing back raw materials, luxury goods, and the knowledge that accumulates through contact with other worlds. These ships were not the great war vessels of later centuries, nor were they the lumbering cargo hulks of later Mediterranean trade. Rather, they were smaller, more agile vessels, capable of coastal sailing where one never lost sight of land for long, yet brave enough to venture further when conditions permitted. The evidence comes from frescoes and from the wrecks themselves, preserved in the anaerobic depths, their timber and their cargo telling stories across 3.5 millennia. These ships carried the distinctive Minoan pottery, those beautiful vessels with their natural, flowing designs, and where that pottery appears in archaeological layers, there lies a testimony to Minoan presence, Minoan contact, Minoan exchange. The network that these traders wove was not centrally planned, but rather organically emerged from individual and group enterprise, constrained and channeled by the palace. Egyptian tombs of the 15th dynasty contain scenes of Aegean traders, their skin painted a distinctive shade, their clothing distinctive, clearly marking them as visitors from across the sea. The correspondence between Minoan pottery styles and Egyptian chronology, in fact, provides one of our most reliable tools for dating Minoan civilization itself. When we find Minoan pottery in a dated Egyptian tomb, or Egyptian scarabs and alabaster vessels in a Minoan context, we can triangulate time itself. The goods that flowed into Crete tell a tale of far-flung ambition. Tin arrived from the distant lands of Anatolia, or, through intermediaries, from as far as the mines of Afghanistan, a precious metal essential for bronze production. Lapis lazuli, that stunning deep blue stone, came from the mountains of Afghanistan as well, passing through how many hands, crossing how many miles, before reaching a Cretan craftsperson's workshop. Cedar from the mountains of Lebanon arrived in logs, prized for its durability and its fragrance, used in palace construction and for the timber frames of ships. Ivory carved from hippo or elephant tusks, Egyptian faience, Syrian murex shells. The inventory reads like an ancient collector's cabinet, and all of it passed through the hands of middlemen, traders, and the palace administrators who taxed and regulated the flow. In return, Crete sent forth its olive oil in quantities vast enough to have shaped ancient economies. Wine, too, in enormous amphoras, traveled to Egypt and the Levantine coast. Fine pottery, carrying food or standing as an object of value in itself, became a sort of ancient export good, and Minoan pottery has been found across the Mediterranean and beyond, a permanent record of trade and contact written in clay. Tin and copper acquired through this network were worked into bronze by master smiths, who created weapons and vessels and figurines that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. The palaces themselves became central clearinghouses for this activity. Huge storage magazines, rooms built for nothing but the stockpiling of goods awaiting shipment or redistribution, honeycombed beneath the palace floors. At Knossos, these storage rooms held hundreds upon hundreds of large clay pots, some nearly a meter tall, designed to hold oil or wine, and the sheer quantity suggests an operation of enormous scale. The palace did not merely participate in trade, it orchestrated and controlled it, ensuring that goods were collected, stored, shipped, and that the returns flowed back to the center. This control itself became a source of power and authority, for without the palace's infrastructure and its connections to distant markets, individual merchants could accomplish little. And yet a curious fact emerges from the evidence. We find relatively little evidence for coercion or direct exploitation in the archaeological record of Minoan society. No great walls fortified Crete's cities, no hordes of weapons stockpiled in warrior quarters, as in the Mycenaean palaces to the north. This peaceful quality, this apparent confidence in prosperity without militarization, suggests a society that, at least for much of its history, achieved its wealth and maintained its order through trade and regulation rather than through the threat of force. Was this a utopia? Certainly not. All ancient societies had hierarchies and imbalances. But it was perhaps a society in which the interests of the rulers and the ruled aligned more closely than in many of its contemporaries, because the stability and continued prosperity upon which the elite depended required that ordinary people have enough to invest in the future, enough to plant olives that would bear fruit for their children and grandchildren, enough to build homes that spoke of security. The walls of Knossos hold secrets painted so vividly that across 3,500 years, the pigments still seem to shimmer with the moisture of their making. When you stand before these frescoes, and perhaps you have, or perhaps you will someday, there is a peculiar sensation, as though you are being invited into a room where people have just stepped away. The paint is ochre and azurite and verdigris green, applied in quick, confident strokes across wet plaster by artisans whose names we will never know. whose hands shaped something that endures far beyond the kingdoms they served. The dolphins are among the most famous, and there is a gentleness to them that speaks to something essential about how the Minoans saw their world. These are not the fierce, mythologized creatures of later literature. They are playful, almost tender, rendered in profile as if frozen mid-leap, their bodies fluid and sinuous against a background of pale cream or warm terracotta. The dolphin fresco from the Queen's Megaron, the great ceremonial room in the palace's private quarters, shows at least 3 of these creatures in postures of such natural joy that one wonders what drew the Minoan eye so persistently to the sea. Was it merely observation, or something deeper, a kind of gratitude for the waters that sustained their trade routes and fed their tables? The dolphins appear not as isolated decorative flourishes, but as integral parts of an entire visual language. Around them, the palace walls bloomed with pattern and motion. Flowering plants spring from rocky outcroppings. Ivy leaves curl and twist. There is an almost botanical precision to some elements, a dreamy abandon to others. One senses that the artists were working from direct observation. They knew how olive branches bend, how the petals of a crocus unfold, but they were also following an aesthetic impulse that belonged entirely to their own time and place. The Minoans seemed to live in constant dialogue with nature, and their walls became a kind of crystallized conversation. Then there are the saffron gatherers, and here we encounter something perhaps more mysterious. In the fresco fragment now housed in the Heraklion Museum, figures, almost certainly young women, though some scholars have suggested they might represent youths of indeterminate gender, move through a landscape collecting crocuses. The flowers are rendered in that distinctive Minoan palette, delicate and precise. The gatherers bend and reach with an ease that speaks to the ordinary rhythms of work, yet there is ceremony in their gestures too. Some scholars suggest that saffron held ritual significance in Minoan culture, perhaps in religious rites or in the preparation of the body for sacred occasions. Others point out that saffron is simply valuable, and the image celebrates an important economic activity. The truth, as is so often the case with ancient art, likely contains elements of both. The sacred and the practical were not always distinct categories in ancient Crete. What strikes one about these agricultural scenes is their absence of the kind of hierarchy or stratification that dominates the art of many contemporary civilizations. There are no figures depicted as larger or more prominent to signify their importance. There is no clear visual narrative of victory or conquest. Instead, there is activity, purposeful, engaged, inhabited. The frescoes celebrate the world as it was lived, not as a propaganda exercise designed to flatter power. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that the power of Minoan rulers expressed itself through the celebration of life itself, through the rendering of beauty and abundance, rather than through the traditional means of displaying dominance and force. And then the bull leapers. The image is arresting, almost unsettling in its energy. Here, in what appears to be a scene from the palace court at Knossos, human figures interact with a massive bull in a way that seems to violate every instinct of self-preservation. The most famous version shows a female figure, indicated by her slender waist and pale skin, rendered according to the Minoan color convention that depicted women with lighter tones and men with darker, grasping the horns of a charging bull. Behind and before her, other figures are caught in what appears to be a moment of acrobatic danger. One figure seems poised on the back of the beast itself. Another waits, arms raised, as though to catch and steady a companion mid-leap. What was this activity? A sport? A ritual? A religious ceremony? A mixture of all three? The debate has occupied scholars for decades, and there are thoughtful voices on multiple sides. Some interpret it as evidence of actual bull leaping, a dangerous practice conducted perhaps as a test of courage or skill, possibly associated with fertility rituals or coming-of-age ceremonies. Others suggest the frescoes may depict a moment of mythological significance, and that the literal recreation of such a feat might have been rare or ceremonial rather than regular. What we can say with confidence is that it was important enough to the Minoan imagination to be painted in one of the palace's most prominent spaces, and important enough to appear again and again in seal stones and other artistic media. The composition of the bull-leaping fresco reveals something about Minoan artistic sophistication. The artist has managed to convey movement and danger through line and posture. The bull is rendered in profile, a convention shared with Egyptian art, yet the dynamics of the scene feel entirely distinct. There is a narrative unfolding across the plaster, a sense of time and motion that Egyptian art, with its more formal and static quality, typically avoided. The bodies of the acrobats twist and arc. There is rhythm and momentum, a visual pulse that seems to carry your eye through the scene. What made the Minoans commit these images to their palace walls with such frequency and care? Part of the answer surely lies in the sheer aesthetic pleasure they took in representation. The Minoan artistic tradition shows no signs of reluctance or hesitation. The artists painted with confidence and speed, with color applied boldly, and with an evident joy in the medium itself. But there may be something more. In a world without the written word, or rather, in a world where the written word existed but remained restricted to administrative purposes, the walls of the palace served as a kind of public scripture. They told you who these people were, what they valued, how they saw their place in the cosmos. The frescoes speak of a society intimately connected to the natural world, whether through the observation of animals and plants, or through the rendering of human activity within landscape. They suggest a visual culture that was sophisticated, confident, and fundamentally different from the more martial and hierarchical artistic traditions of the Near East and North Africa. There is an openness in Minoan art, a willingness to depict humans and animals in close proximity, in moments of danger or exertion or simple daily work. Power, when it manifests in the frescoes at all, tends to express itself through patronage and the commissioning of beautiful things, rather than through the depiction of conquest and subjection. As you contemplate these painted walls, whether you do so in imagination or through the pages of a book or on a screen, there is a certain poignancy in the knowledge that they were created by individuals working within a specific moment in time, responding to specific commissions and traditions, yet somehow managing to speak across millennia to a viewer who shares almost no context with them. The paint itself is ancient matter, mineral and pigment that has absorbed and released the light of thousands of years. The hands that applied it have long since returned to dust, yet the images they created remain, still speaking of dolphins and flowers, still capturing in amber the moment when a human figure reaches toward the horns of a charging bull, still suggesting a world in which beauty was something worth protecting, worth rendering permanent in stone and plaster and color. The religion of ancient Crete remains one of archaeology's most haunting puzzles, because it left no written doctrine, no commandments carved into stone, yet everywhere you turn in the ruins, you find her, the goddess, in 1,000 iterations, worshipped across a landscape that felt sacred in its entirety. The Minoans seemed to see divinity not locked behind temple walls, but pulsing through the natural world itself, and in this, perhaps they held a view of the holy that many later civilizations would spend centuries trying to recover. The primary figure, the one we might call the great goddess, or the mistress of animals, appears across Minoan art with a consistency that speaks to something deeply rooted in the culture's spiritual heart. She stands with her arms raised, sometimes in pose of power and sometimes in blessing, adorned with the high-crested crown that would echo forward into later Greek imagery of the divine feminine. But she is not alone. She is accompanied by serpents coiling around her arms and body, and here we must pause to consider what this might have meant. The snake in many ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures carried ambivalent significance. It was healer and destroyer, the creature that sheds its skin and is reborn, the guardian of the threshold between worlds. Priestesses served this goddess, and the evidence for this comes partly from the frescoes of Knossos and other palace sites, where women appear in positions of obvious ritual authority and prominence. Some scholars believe these may have been actual priestesses, real women who held sacred office within Minoan society. Among the most intriguing images are those depicting what may have been snake priestesses, women who seem to have held or controlled serpents as part of their ceremonial duties. Several terracotta figurines have been discovered, notably from the sanctuary at Gornia, showing female figures with their arms raised and serpents coiling around their bodies. Whether these were literal ritual practices or symbolic representations of a priestess's spiritual authority remains debated by scholars, but the intensity and repetition of these images suggests something more than mere decoration. The Minoans worshipped not only in grand palaces, but also in the heights of their island, in sanctuaries perched on mountain peaks that would have been visible for great distances across the Cretan landscape. These peak sanctuaries, as archaeologists call them, were sacred spaces constructed at the summits of mountains, places where the sky seemed closer and the boundary between earth and heaven grew thin. At sites like the peak sanctuary on Mount Juktas, or on the heights above the Lasithi Plateau, there are remains of small stone structures, altars, and accumulations of votive offerings. Pilgrims would climb these heights, perhaps in procession, perhaps in search of personal communion with the divine. The exhaustion of the ascent, the thinning of the air, the vast view spreading below, these physical experiences would have deepened the sense of encounter with something greater than oneself. But the Minoans also carried their rituals downward, into caves carved from the red earth and white limestone of their island. The sacred caves of Crete held a unique place in their religious imagination. Caves like the Skotano cave, the Idaean cave on Mount Ida, and numerous others throughout the island became spaces of worship and initiation. These underground chambers, some vast enough to hold hundreds of people, some intimate and narrow, would have been lit by flickering torchlight, their stalactites and stalagmites creating an otherworldly landscape that needed little artifice to seem divine. The caves would have been cool and still, insulated from the heat and noise of the world above. Archaeological evidence from cave deposits shows that people left votive offerings here for centuries. Small figurines, clay vessels, sometimes weapons or tools. Water trickled through these caves, and the Minoans may have seen in this constant, gentle seeping a sign of the goddess's presence, her nurturing and continuous blessing. The rituals that took place in these spaces remain mostly mysteries, locked away in time, but from the pottery and deposits left behind, we can infer that people came for healing, for petition, perhaps for initiation into sacred mysteries that would have marked crucial transitions in their lives. The bull-leaping scenes on the palace frescoes hint at rituals of danger and transcendence, moments where young people, male and female, would have tested themselves against the sacred animal in ceremonies that may have held profound spiritual significance. What becomes clear, the deeper you look at Minoan religious practice, is that the boundary between the everyday and the sacred was far more permeable than in many later cultures. The goddesses and rituals were woven into the fabric of agricultural and maritime life. The seasons were marked by ceremonies that honored both divine will and practical human need. The spring flowers, the grain harvest, the sailing season, all were sacred moments, moments when the divine and human orders intersected and reinforced each other. One might imagine that for a Minoan farmer on Crete, tending an olive grove, or attending to sheep, the goddess was not a distant abstraction, but a living presence in the land itself, encountered in the sanctuary caves, remembered in the palace frescoes, felt in the fertility of the soil. And there is something profoundly soothing in this vision of the religious life, a spirituality that did not demand rejection of the material world or the body, but rather celebrated the sensory, the natural, the immediate. The Minoans seem to have been a people who saw the sacred not as something separate from life, but as its deepest dimension, the truth that moved through everything. The sea that surrounded Crete was not a barrier to the Minoans. It was their truest home, their marketplace, their highway. From the harbors nestled along Crete's northern and southern coasts, their ships embarked on voyages that would eventually reshape the economic map of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. These were not the warships of later Greek navies, sleek with ramming prows. The Minoan vessels were something altogether different. Broad-beamed, deep-hulled craft designed to carry goods and people across distances that, to their contemporaries, must have seemed almost impossible. Consider the sheer ambition of seafaring in the middle of the second millennium before our era. There were no compasses, no charts marked with currents and safe passages. Navigation depended on the stars, on the color of the water, on the flight patterns of birds, on an accumulated memory held within families of sailors who had learned, through generations of near disasters and near successes, which routes the sea would permit. Yet the Minoans mastered these routes, and their merchants became the connective tissue binding together a world that might otherwise have remained fragmented and isolated. The harbors themselves reveal the sophistication of Minoan maritime infrastructure. At Komos, on the southern coast of Crete, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of vast storage facilities, massive pithos jars stacked in warehouses, some taller than a person, waiting to be filled with wine, olive oil, or grain for export. These were not improvised structures, but carefully planned facilities, built with the kind of forethought that speaks to generations of maritime commerce. The timber needed to construct such facilities came from Crete's pine forests, carefully selected and shaped. The labor required was enormous. All of this suggests something crucial. The Minoans did not stumble into seafaring. They invested in it, planned for it, believed so deeply in its promise that they built permanent infrastructure to support it. What goods flowed outward from Crete? Pottery, certainly. Those distinctive Minoan vessels with their dancing abstractions and naturalistic motifs were so valued that copies and imitations appear in archaeological sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The workshops of Knossos and other centers produced ceramics with such consistent excellence that buyers came to trust the Minoan mark as a guarantee of quality, much as certain labels guarantee quality today. Beyond pottery, Cretan wine became legendary. The volcanic soil of the island, combined with the Mediterranean climate, created conditions ideal for viticulture. Wine from Crete commanded premium prices in foreign courts. Egyptian tomb paintings show Syrian traders arriving with Cretan amphorae, their distinctive shapes unmistakable even in two-dimensional representations. And what flowed inward? The answer is complex and speaks to Crete's position as a crossroads. From Egypt came luxury goods, lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone more precious than gold in the ancient world, quarried in distant Afghanistan but traded through Egyptian hands into Cretan hands. From the Near East came cedar wood, a timber of extraordinary durability and fragrance, prized for shipbuilding and temple construction. Tin arrived from sources that remain debated, but likely included regions far beyond the Aegean, possibly from Anatolia, possibly from even more distant sources. Tin was essential because it was the crucial ingredient in bronze, the metal that gave the Bronze Age its name. Without tin trade, Crete's metalworkers could not have produced the magnificent bronze vessels and weapons that showcase Minoan craftsmanship. The relationship between Crete and Egypt was particularly intimate. By the reign of Thutmose III, around 1450 before the Common Era, Cretan merchants maintained a regular presence in Egyptian ports. Whether it was called Keftiu by the Egyptians or some other name remains uncertain, but Egyptian scribes clearly recognized the Cretans as a distinct and prosperous people. Egyptian murals depict Cretan ambassadors or traders bearing gifts, often the very same kinds of goods we find catalogued in the warehouses and storerooms of Knossos. These exchanges were likely formal, conducted between courts and officials rather than as simple merchant-to-merchant transactions. The presence of Egyptian artifacts in Minoan contexts, small sphinx figurines, scarabs, vessels inscribed with Egyptian cartouches, testifies to these diplomatic and commercial bonds. What draws this picture into particular focus, though, is the question of what such trade meant for Minoan society itself. The wealth that flowed back to Crete did not distribute evenly. The great palaces grew ever more elaborate and expensive. The frescoes adorning their walls became more ambitious, the stored treasures more abundant. A class of merchants and administrators emerged, men and women whose power derived not from land ownership or religious authority alone, but from control of maritime trade. These individuals would have understood the sea in ways most of their contemporaries did not. They would have known the routes, the seasons, the protocols of foreign ports. They carried knowledge that was valuable precisely because it was uncommon. The shipwrecks discovered off Crete's coasts offer another window into this maritime world. The most famous is the vessel that sank near Ulu Burun, off the coast of what is now Turkey, a ship laden with tin, copper, cedar, and exotic goods, likely destroyed by storm or reef in the mid-14th century before our era. While not definitively Minoan, the cargo and the ship's characteristics suggest either Minoan ownership or transport among networks that Minoan merchants dominated. From the perspective of someone aboard that vessel as it went down, the accumulated wealth of the Bronze Age Mediterranean was sinking into darkness. From our perspective, millennia later, that wreck has become a kind of time capsule, preserving in waterlogged wood and corroded metal the complexity of Bronze Age trade. How did Crete maintain its position as the central node in these vast networks? Geography provided a foundation. The island's location between Egypt, the Levantine coast, and the Aegean proper was ideal. But geography alone does not create commerce. There had to be political stability. There had to be the infrastructure, the trained personnel, the institutional memory that allowed consistent, reliable trade. The palaces appear to have served, in part, as the organizing centers for this entire system. Perhaps official traders worked on behalf of the palace. Perhaps the palace taxed merchants in exchange for protection and access to port facilities. The precise mechanisms remain opaque, but the result is clear. Crete became, in a meaningful sense, the broker and banker of the Eastern Mediterranean during the height of the Minoan period. In the harbors of cities like Komos or Chania, one might have encountered peoples from across the known world. Syrian and Levantine merchants brought goods from their home ports. Egyptian traders and officials conducted business with their Cretan counterparts. Merchants from the Aegean islands came to purchase Cretan wine and pottery. The bustle of language, the smell of tar and salt and exotic goods, the sound of negotiation and transaction. These harbors would have been alive with the energy of commerce. Yet, they would also have been fragile. A single storm could destroy vessels and fortunes. A single interruption in supplies, if tin failed to arrive, if Egyptian demand shifted, could disrupt the entire system. It is worth pausing to consider what might have seemed, to a Minoan of the 14th century before the Common Era, like the natural and permanent order of things. The palace at Knossos had stood for centuries, growing more elaborate with each renovation. The trade networks had generated wealth for generations. The harbors hummed with activity, year after year. The ships came and went, their holds filled with treasure. It might have seemed as though this prosperity would continue indefinitely, that the system was too large, too well established, too crucial to the wider world to ever collapse. Yet within that apparent permanence lay fragility. The entire structure rested on assumptions that would soon be shattered. On the island of Crete, in the early 1900s, archaeologists began uncovering something that would trouble scholars for more than a century. Among the ruins of palaces and settlements, scattered across clay tablets and sometimes pressed into the soft surfaces of ritual vessels, lay a script. It was distinctive, unmistakable, and utterly resistant to translation. We call it Linear A, and its silence is perhaps one of archaeology's most persistent whispers, a language that refuses to give up its meaning, even now. The Minoans, those sophisticated people who painted their walls with grace and sailed their ships across wine-dark seas, kept records. We know this with certainty. They documented transactions, offerings, inventories, and administrative decisions. The evidence lies in clay tablets, each one inscribed with careful, deliberate symbols. Some tablets are small and humble, perhaps recording the accounting of grain or oil. Others carry the weight of formal decree, their characters arranged in careful rows that suggest importance, authority, ritual weight. Yet when we look at these tablets today, we are looking at a language almost entirely locked away from us, an administrative system that functioned perfectly well for its time, but has left us standing at the threshold of understanding, unable to cross over. What makes this mystery so particular, so almost poignant, is that Linear A is neither incomprehensible nor undecipherable in principle. It is a real writing system created by real people to express real thoughts, real numbers, real intentions. We can count the individual signs. We have catalogued somewhere between 40 and 80 distinct characters, depending on how one groups them, and we have found several hundred clay tablets inscribed with these symbols. Some tablets appear in multiple copies, suggesting they conveyed standardized information. The script appears on religious objects, on merchant weights, on the stirrup jars that were traded throughout the Mediterranean. It is organized, systematic, and clearly served a communicative purpose, yet it remains, tantalizingly, beyond our full grasp. The frustration, one might imagine, is something akin to holding a letter sealed in a glass case. You can see the handwriting. You can observe the care taken in each stroke. You may even recognize certain patterns or repeated elements. But the words themselves, the meaning contained in that careful script, remains forever separated from you by an invisible barrier. This is the feeling that Linear A evokes in modern scholarship, a sense of proximity without possession, of almost understanding that never quite arrives. Part of the difficulty lies in the very foundation of decipherment. The most successful decipherment efforts in archaeological history have depended on one crucial element, a bilingual text, or some form of linguistic bridge. When the Rosetta Stone was discovered in Egypt, it contained the same text written in both Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphics, providing the key to unlock an entire ancient language. But Linear A offers no such help. There is no Linear A text paired with a language we understand. There are no Cretan Greek bilinguals, no helpful inscriptions left behind by those who knew both the Minoan tongue and a later language scholars could read. The Minoans and the Greeks who came after them did not share a written language long enough for that precious overlap to remain in the archaeological record. This is not to say that scholars have not tried. Many have attempted to read Linear A as an early form of Greek, supposing that the Minoans and Greeks shared a linguistic foundation, but the attempts consistently falter. The structures do not align. The frequencies of certain characters do not match what we know about Greek phonetics. It seems increasingly likely that the Minoans spoke a non-Indo-European language, something fundamentally different from the speech of the Greek peoples who would eventually inhabit the same islands and build their own civilizations upon Minoan ruins. If this is true, and most scholars now lean toward this conclusion, then Linear A represents not merely an unknown language, but one that has no close living relatives, no descendant tongues to offer hints about its meaning. There is something rather moving about this, in a way. It means that the Minoan voice, insofar as it survives in written form, speaks truly in isolation. When we look at their tablets, we are not translating through the filter of a related language. We are confronting something genuinely foreign, something that belongs entirely to a world that is gone. The administrative records of Minoan kings, the inventory of Minoan temples, the very thoughts that Minoan scribes carefully inscribed, all of these remain within that closed world, accessible in form but not in content. What we can do, tentatively and with great care, is gather context clues. When a tablet shows a symbol followed by a clear number, and when that number appears in association with what looks like grain or oil in an image, we may reasonably infer that the preceding symbol relates to grain or oil. We can study the patterns of sign frequencies. We can note which signs appear frequently, which rarely, and how they group together. We can observe that certain signs seem to cluster at the beginning of entries and others at the end, suggesting that the script follows certain logical organizational principles, much as we might expect an administrative system to do. These are slow, incremental approaches, building tiny islands of understanding in an otherwise vast sea of uncertainty. Some scholars have proposed that linear A might eventually yield to computational analysis, that digital tools and statistical methods might reveal patterns that human eyes and minds have missed. There is hope in these approaches, and there is also the quiet awareness that linear A might simply remain a closed book. Not all mysteries, even those preserved in such careful, lasting form, can be solved. Some knowledge is genuinely lost, sealed away not by intention but by simple historical accident. The extinction of a language, the passage of centuries, the weight of time itself. Yet this very resistance, this refusal to surrender its meaning easily, lends linear a strange kind of poetry. It is a reminder that not everything the ancients created has been handed down to us in usable form. Not every truth survives. The Minoans thrived for centuries on Crete, built magnificent palaces, traded across an empire of islands and distant shores, and developed a written system to record their doings. But the heart of what they thought, the precise cadence of what they spoke, the particular weight of their words as they moved from mouth to inscription, these remain beyond our reach, hovering in a place between knowledge and mystery, between sight and blindness. It is a humbling realization, and perhaps an important one. It reminds us that history is not always transparent, that the past does not always yield its secrets simply because we wish it to, and that there are languages yet untranslated, whispers yet unheard, waiting in the dust and stone of antiquity. And yet, for all the domestic grace the Minoans wove through their palaces and homes, there lived in their world an animal that would outlast their civilization by thousands of years, transformed from a creature of flesh and horns into something far more mythological, far more eternal, the bull, not merely as livestock or a beast of burden, but as a symbol that seemed to contain within it something essential about Minoan power, fertility, danger, and the strange union between human and animal that lay at the heart of their most sacred rituals. To understand how a real animal became a monster, we must first sit with what the Minoans themselves believed. The bull appeared everywhere in their art, not as a thing to be conquered or dominated, in the way later Greek heroes would dominate things, but as something to be engaged with, even revered. Young men and women, depicted in vivid fresco and relief, appear to be performing acrobatic feats against bulls, leaping over their horns, somersaulting across their backs, dancing between their charge with a grace that seems almost impossible. These are not hunts. They are not scenes of slaughter or sport, in any sense a later audience would recognize. The bull leapings, as archaeologists call them, were something different entirely. Ritual performances, perhaps, tests of courage, or sacred dances where the boundary between human and beast became temporarily, thrillingly, almost permeable. Consider what the Minoans might have felt, watching a young person move with such precision and trust around something so powerful. There is a kind of intimacy in it, a knowledge. These performers knew the animal, its weight, its temperament, the moment of its charge. And the animal, in turn, seems to tolerate their presence in a way that suggests this was not a first encounter, not an improvised contest, but a choreography rehearsed and sacred. But later Greeks, the ones who would inherit the ruins of Minoan civilization and reshape its stories, they did not perform bull dances. They had not lived in the shadow of a volcanic island where powerful things could appear at any moment. They had inherited only the memory of the ritual, garbled, reinterpreted, pushed through the lens of their own understanding. And somewhere in that process of forgetting and remembering, the bull became something else. The Minotaur, part man, part beast, locked away, hungry, monstrous. How does a sacred dance become a prison, you might wonder? How does a ritual transformation become a curse? The answer lies in the way myths travel. They are not stable things. They shift like sand. The stories the Greeks told about Crete, about King Minos, about his labyrinth, about the tributes of youth sent from Athens to be devoured. These were stories told by people who lived after the Minoan world had already vanished. They were stories told about a place they did not fully understand, about people whose writing they could not read, whose palaces they walked through as ruins. And so they filled in the gaps with their own fears, their own values, their own sense of what was monstrous and what was civilized. Theseus slaying the Minotaur. The image is so powerful, so perfectly symmetrical in its heroism. A young man from Athens, traveling to a foreign island to face a monster, a creature that was the shameful secret of a corrupt king, a thing that had to be destroyed. It reads like justice, like order triumphing over chaos, light over darkness, humanity over bestial nature. And for centuries, this is the story that survived. This is the image that lived in the minds of people across the Mediterranean and beyond. But what if you were to flip the perspective, just slightly? What if the bull dancers of the Minoan palace were not victims waiting to be slain, but practitioners of something the later Greeks simply did not have the framework to understand? What if what they called a labyrinth was not a maze designed to confuse and trap, but a palace, complex and winding, and filled with the ordinary chambers of daily life, where religious ceremonies that included bulls took place in courtyards and halls whose layout seemed deliberately intricate? What if the tributes that Athenian youths supposedly sent were not sacrifices at all, but initiates, traveling to participate in mysteries and rituals they were sworn never to reveal? It is not possible to know. The Minoans left no written accounts of how they understood their own rituals, no texts that survived to explain to later ages what the bull dancers were actually doing, or what it meant. This silence, this absence of voice, may have made it easier for the Greeks to overwrite the story entirely. Yet there is something worth reflecting on in this transformation. The Minoans themselves had a different relationship to the bull than their successors would. They had woven it into their everyday landscape, their art, their devotion. They had made it a partner in ritual, not a threat to be overcome. And perhaps this very comfort with the animal, this integration of danger and power into the sacred life of the community, is what the later Greeks found most incomprehensible. They made it monstrous because they could not imagine it any other way. The bull that a Minoan priestess might have stood before in a peak sanctuary, perhaps crowned with horns herself, made into a conduit for divine power. That same bull became in the Greek imagination a hybrid monster locked beneath the earth, requiring human flesh, demanding death. The transformation tells us something about how civilizations see each other across time. It tells us how the stories of the vanquished are always rewritten by the victorious, how memory itself becomes a kind of labyrinth, twisting back on itself, leading you deeper into confusion when you are trying to find your way toward truth. But the bull remained, even as the stories changed, even as the meaning shifted and the Minoans themselves faded into legend. The image of the bull persisted as something that mattered. Kings used it as a symbol of their power. Artists returned to it again and again. The creature that had danced through Minoan palaces in rituals we will never fully understand became one of the most recognizable symbols in all of ancient Mediterranean thought. Perhaps that is its own kind of immortality, not the literal survival of the Minoan people themselves, but the persistence of this animal figure, this bridge between the worlds they inhabited and the worlds that came after, transformed and reinterpreted, yet unmistakably connected to something ancient, something sacred, something that the Minoans themselves had cherished. If you had walked through the streets of Knossos on an ordinary morning around 1500 BCE, perhaps during the reign of what archaeologists call the New Palace period, you would have passed houses of varying sizes, each one adapted to the particular needs and fortunes of its inhabitants, yet all of them bearing the unmistakable stamp of Minoan domestic life. The wealthier homes rose several stories high, their walls painted in warm terracottas and creams, with light wells cut into their upper floors to pour daylight down through the chambers below. The poorer dwellings nestled between them, smaller and more modest, but no less part of the living fabric of the city. And what strikes us now, when we examine the remains of these houses, is how differently the Minoans seem to organize their daily existence compared to so many other Bronze Age peoples. The hearth, that ancient center of warmth and cooking, did not dominate the Minoan home as it did elsewhere. Instead, kitchens were often small, functional spaces, sometimes with clay cooking vessels set into the floor itself. Archaeologists believe that much of the food preparation took place in communal ovens shared by several households, or in the courtyards that opened onto the streets. Picture a morning in which the smell of baking bread drifted through the neighborhood, the sound of women grinding grain with hand mills, the soft percussion of daily labor beginning again. Food, in the Minoan world, was wonderfully varied, a reflection of the island's climate and its maritime reach. The staple grains were barley and wheat, stored in large pottery vessels called pithoi, whose smooth, bulging forms are among the most recognizable objects from Minoan archaeology. These vessels were not merely containers, they were architectural elements in themselves, sometimes taller than a person, embedded in the floors and walls of storerooms. Alongside grain came olive oil, perhaps the most precious commodity in the Minoan larder. Olives grew abundantly on Crete's hillsides, and the pressing and storage of oil was a seasonal ritual that structured the agricultural calendar. The oil served not only for cooking, but for lighting lamps, for anointing the body, and for trade. Wine, too, was produced in considerable quantities, fermenting in large vessels and shipped across the Mediterranean in distinctive Minoan amphorae. The diet itself suggests a people comfortable and reasonably prosperous, at least in the towns and among the merchant classes. Legumes, beans, and lentils provided protein and substance. Fish and shellfish were abundant and readily available, given Crete's position surrounded by sea. Meat from cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs appeared on tables, though perhaps not every day for ordinary folk, and evidence suggests that hunting still provided supplementary protein and status through the pursuit of game. Honey was the main sweetener, gathered and stored with careful attention. Seeds and nuts, including sesame, completed a diet that we might recognize as not so different from what people in the Mediterranean eat today, though incomparably fresher and more local. What was eaten was also a matter of ritual and occasion. Minoan feasting practices, glimpsed through fragments of evidence, suggest that shared meals held ceremonial importance. Large rooms in the palaces, with benches arranged along the walls, seemed designed for the gathering of people around food and drink. These were not merely meals. They were performances of social status, affirmation of community bonds, and perhaps also religious observance. The act of eating together was woven into the fabric of Minoan society in ways that pure survival never requires. Clothing in Minoan Crete tells a story of a people living in a warm climate, with access to fine materials and a keen eye for decoration. Women's dresses, as depicted in frescoes and small figurines, were remarkable for their time. The characteristic Minoan woman's dress had a fitted bodice, often left open at the chest in a manner that scandalized later Victorian archaeologists, paired with a flounced skirt that swept down to the ankles in layers or ruffles. The colors were vivid: reds, blues, yellows, achieved through plant and mineral dyes. Hair was arranged in ringlets and waves, sometimes piled high on the crown. Jewelry, particularly in spiral and naturalistic forms, adorned necks and wrists. These were not the modest, concealing garments of some ancient cultures. They were displays of confidence, status, and artistic sensibility. Men wore loincloths or short skirts, often decorated with geometric or linear patterns. They too wore their hair long and carefully styled, sometimes with elaborate headdresses for ceremonial occasions. Both men and women seem to have worn sandals or boots, crafted from leather and plant fibers. The impression that emerges from these images is of a culture where self-presentation and adornment held genuine significance, where the body was not something to be hidden away, but something to be adorned and displayed with intention. Did this reflect a different attitude toward the human form, towards sexuality and gender, than prevailed in other ancient societies? The evidence suggests, intriguingly, yes. The crafting of these beautiful things, the textiles, the jewelry, the decorated vessels, occupied a significant portion of the Minoan day, particularly for women. Spinning and weaving were central to household labor, though whether all women engaged in these tasks or only certain women, as part of their household duty or as skilled artisans, remains slightly unclear. The looms used were vertical looms, made from wood and fitted with clay weights to hold the threads in tension. Fragments of actual textiles, preserved through miracle of preservation in ash, reveal astonishingly complex patterns and colors, suggesting that weaving was not merely a practical skill, but an art form in its own right. Intricate designs incorporating natural motifs, spirals, flowers, marine creatures, were woven into cloth that served both functional and decorative purposes. Pottery making, too, was a significant industry, and while much of it was likely the work of specialist craftspeople, often organized into workshops, the basic work of the household, the making and firing of simple vessels for storage and cooking, would have fallen to members of the family. The famous Minoan pottery, with its marine designs, its naturalistic depictions of octopuses and sea urchins curving gracefully around the vessel, its flowers and foliage rendered in bold, flowing lines, represents one of the highest achievements of Bronze Age art. Yet, alongside these masterpieces, existed humbler, everyday wares, the cups and bowls and cooking pots used in simple meals and ordinary rituals. Both kinds served the Minoan world, and both bear witness to a culture that valued beauty even in functional objects. The rhythm of the day in a Minoan home was structured by light and labor, by seasonal demands and religious observance. Morning would bring the household to waking, with children and servants stirring first, preparing the space for the day ahead. Water would be drawn from wells or cisterns, a task that required strength and coordination, often carried by women in large vessels balanced on the head or held in both hands. The animals, chickens, goats, and possibly cattle, would need tending. Work in the fields, if the household held agricultural land outside the town, would call those capable of such labor. Women would grind grain, prepare food, tend to textile work. Men might engage in trade, in craft work, in the management of household affairs or fields, or in the various duties associated with the palace or the priesthood, if they held such positions. The evening brought a gathering, a quieting. Lamps filled with olive oil and lit with plant fiber wicks provided soft, amber light. Families would share a meal together, speaking in the language we do not fully understand, attending to matters of the household and the community. Religious observance might mark certain days, festivals aligned with the harvest, with the behavior of the stars, with ceremonies honoring the goddess in her various forms. The night would bring sleep, often on simple bedding, perhaps on platforms built into the walls, perhaps on mats and blankets spread across the floor. What emerges from all this modest evidence is a picture of people living with a degree of comfort, order, and aesthetic sensibility. There was labor, certainly, and hierarchy, and tasks that fell more heavily on some than others. Yet there was also space for beauty, for craft, for celebration. The Minoans seemed to have constructed a world in which daily life was not a mere grinding necessity, but something that could be graced with color, with decoration, with intention. In the arrangement of their homes, the care they took with their appearance, the designs they painted on their pots, and the rituals they observed, we glimpse a people for whom the ordinary was capable of being made dignified and beautiful. So what happened when Minoan civilization reached its fullest expression, its moment of greatest confidence and prosperity? What did the world look like from Crete's perspective at the height of the New Palace period, roughly between 1700 and 1600 before the Common Era? Picture, if you will, the palace complex at Knossos, not as the ruin you might see today, but as it existed then, its corridors freshly painted, its courtyards alive with activity, its storage rooms heavy with abundance. The architecture had become more elaborate, more ambitious in its sprawl. Where the first palaces had been rectangular in their thinking, these newer structures seemed to follow a logic of their own, spiraling outward around central courtyards, creating a kind of organic maze that would later seed the very myth of the labyrinth itself. But this was no accidental sprawl. This was the architectural expression of a civilization at ease with itself, confident enough to expand without rigid planning, to let function determine form rather than imposing form upon function. The New Palace period represents, in many ways, a kind of golden age for the Minoans, though we must be cautious with that term, for it carries a weight of nostalgia that historians spend their careers trying to shed. Still, the evidence does speak of prosperity. Pottery workshops flourished. The potter's wheel, which had been introduced earlier, now reached heights of technical and artistic sophistication that would not be surpassed for centuries. The vases themselves became lighter, more delicate, decorated with naturalistic motifs, octopuses and dolphins, and spiraling seaweed rendered with an observation of detail that suggests artists who spent time watching the sea, understanding its creatures not as sacred symbols alone, but as living beings worthy of careful study. The wealth of Crete was not evenly distributed, you understand. The palaces were the homes of an elite, whether you call them kings or priests, or some combination of the two remains uncertain. Beneath them lived administrators, craftspeople, merchants, farmers, and those whose labor sustained the whole enterprise. But even ordinary homes during this period showed signs of material comfort that would have been unthinkable in earlier generations. Pottery vessels for storage and cooking appear in greater quantities. Access to luxury goods, even for non-elite families, suggests an economy that was generating surplus and distributing it, at least partially, down through the layers of society. This was an age when Cretan ships were sailing farther than ever, carrying goods to Egypt, to the Levantine coast, to Cyprus, and beyond. There was contact with the Hittites, that vast empire of Anatolia whose written records sometimes mention these seafaring people from the south. And there was something else happening during this period, a sense of cultural confidence that manifested in the materials people chose to surround themselves with, in the stories their art was telling. The Minoans seemed less concerned with projecting military power, at least in their artistic record, and more interested in celebrating the fertility of their land, the abundance of their seas, the pleasures of sport and ritual and communal life. Now, across the sea to the north, about 100 kilometers from the coast of Crete, lies a small island called Thera, known in modern times as Santorini, and on this island, during the exact same period when Knossos was reaching its grandeur, a sister settlement was developing, mirroring in many ways the culture and prosperity of the larger civilization. This settlement, called Akrotiri, is perhaps one of the most poignant archaeological sites in the world, for it has been frozen in time in a way that few places have ever been, and that freezing tells a story we have not yet fully finished comprehending. Akrotiri was no small village. It was a substantial settlement, probably home to several thousand people, and it embodied all the hallmarks of Minoan civilization. The houses there were multi-storied, some with upper floors used for administrative purposes or as workshops, lower floors serving as living quarters and storage. The pottery found in Akrotiri is identical in style and quality to what emerges from Crete proper, suggesting not a colony in the sense of a distant outpost, but rather an integral part of the same cultural and economic network. The frescoes that adorned its walls, and of these there are many beautifully preserved examples, depict the same scenes of naturalism and sensuality that characterized Minoan art. One fresco shows a woman gathering saffron, a spice valued throughout the ancient world for its flavor and its use in dyes. Her figure is rendered with grace and proportion, her attention focused entirely on the delicate flowers before her, and you can almost feel the morning light that the artist is trying to capture. Another shows young men and women in what appears to be a boxing or athletic context, their bodies supple and animated, their engagement in the activity genuine and joyful. These are not images created for propaganda or display of power, but rather glimpses of the actual life that people were living, the small pleasures and daily activities that they thought worth recording, worth preserving in color and pigment on their walls. What did the inhabitants of Akrotiri know about the ground beneath their feet? Did they feel the occasional tremor, the small shifts that might have reminded them, in the way the human body forgets and must be reminded, that they were living on an island that was geologically restless? What did they understand about the mountains and valleys that made up their landscape? The geology of Thera is complex and volatile. It is, in essence, the rim of an ancient caldera, a massive volcanic crater that collapsed into itself thousands of years before the Minoans ever arrived. The island they inhabited was built atop a system of geological tensions that were slowly building pressure, year by year, century by century, moving toward a release that would reshape not just this small island, but the entire history of the Aegean world. But for now, in this moment of the High New Palace period, Akrotiri was flourishing. Its streets were orderly and well-drained, indicating a sophisticated understanding of urban planning. Its residents were engaged in trade and craft and the ordinary business of living, seemingly unaware that they were living in the shadow of something vast and transformative. The pottery kilns still fired their wares. The women still gathered saffron from the delicate flowers. The young people still trained in their athletic contests, their bodies beautiful and strong in the morning light. The frescoes were still being painted, fresh pigment applied to damp plaster, creating images that would endure in preserved form for nearly 4,000 years, but which the artists themselves would never see mature and age. This is perhaps one of the great melancholy aspects of Akrotiri, that we can see so clearly into the lives of its inhabitants, understand so intimately the texture of their daily existence, precisely because their world was interrupted and preserved in the moment of its fullest expression. They were not in decline, they were not struggling or suffering, they were simply living, in that complete and unself-conscious way that people do when they believe the world around them is stable, is comprehensible, is theirs to inhabit for generations to come. And that sense of peace, that assumption of continuity, makes what was about to happen all the more startling to contemplate across the centuries. Beneath the sapphire waters of the Aegean, 36 kilometers north of Crete, lay an island that very few people understood. Thera, as the ancients called it, rose from the seabed as a peak of volcanic rock crowned with settlements and vineyards, a place of ordinary abundance where farmers tended their fields and potters shaped their clay in workshop courtyards, open to the Mediterranean light. But Thera was built upon something older and infinitely more patient than human civilization, a volcano that had been quiet for centuries, whose deep chambers lay filled with molten rock under pressures we can barely fathom even now. The geology of Thera tells a story written in stone and fire, a narrative that geologists have learned to read through careful study of ash layers, core samples from the seabed, and the crystalline structures of minerals formed in heat. The island itself sat atop what volcanologists now call a caldera, a vast underground chamber carved out by ancient eruptions, a void waiting to be filled. Above this chamber, the crust had sealed itself. What we know with reasonable certainty is that around 1625 years before the Common Era, something began to stir in those deep chambers. The process would have been slow. Magma, less dense than the rock around it, began to rise from deeper layers of the Earth's mantle, where incomprehensible heat and pressure cook stone into liquid. As it ascended, it carried with it dissolved gases, water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, all seeking release. The rising magma fractured the rock above it, creating pathways. New magma followed those paths, and the chamber grew warmer. The pressure increased, day by day, month by month, year by year. If you had stood on Thera during this time, you would have felt nothing, seen nothing. The island presented itself to the world as it always had, serene and productive. But the warning signs were there for those who might have recognized them. There is a quality to volcanically active islands that modern instruments can detect with precision, though the ancients could only experience it as a kind of vague unease. The ground itself begins to shift. Earthquakes, small tremors at first, then stronger ones, ripple through the rock. Springs change their character, becoming warmer or more sulfurous. Animals behave strangely, as if sensing a disturbance in the fabric of the world that human senses cannot directly perceive. On Thera, the evidence suggests that minor eruptions may have occurred, small expulsions of ash and pumice that warned of larger forces gathering below. Did the inhabitants notice? Almost certainly. Did they understand what these signs meant? That question remains more difficult to answer. The people who lived on Thera during this time were not primitive. They were sophisticated Minoan settlers who had built homes of solid stone, who decorated their walls with frescoes of flowers and monkeys, who produced pottery of considerable elegance. In the settlement that archaeologists call Akrotiri, buried now beneath meters of ash and pumice, we can walk through streets that feel almost alive with the presence of the people who once rushed through them. They had storage jars filled with grain and oil. They had children's toys and merchants' scales. They had wine in their cellars and copper pots in their kitchens. This was a community of traders and farmers and craftspeople, integrated into the broader Minoan world, connected by ship to Egypt and to Crete itself. Why would they leave? What would compel them to abandon everything? The mystery deepens when we examine the archaeological evidence carefully. Around the time that the earthquakes were growing more frequent and intense, many of the buildings at Akrotiri show signs of careful abandonment. Items that would have been valuable, copper tools, bronze vessels, even precious objects, were left behind. But the bodies of the residents are absent. They did not perish in their homes. They fled. The evidence suggests that the people of Thera read the warnings written in trembling earth and sulphurous air, and they chose to depart before the catastrophe came. Some may have sailed to Crete, others may have scattered to nearby islands. They possessed, it seems, the wisdom that comes from living in a volatile landscape, an understanding that the earth beneath your feet is not always stable, that paradise can shift and shake. And beneath that trembling ground, the pressure continued to build. The magma chambers were nearly full now. The dissolved gases within the rising molten rock had accumulated to extraordinary concentrations, held in check only by the weight of the stone above. The volcano was approaching a kind of saturation, a point beyond which the system cannot remain in equilibrium. The rock had been fractured and weakened by thousands of earthquakes. New pathways to the surface had been created and sealed again. The island that once seemed so solid was becoming a fragile thing, a thin crust above an abyss. What we can say with confidence is that Thera was an active stratovolcano, the kind that builds itself through layers of successive eruptions over vast stretches of time. The rocks that make up the island were formed by dozens of major explosions spread across millennia. Each eruption had added a new layer, a new chapter in volcanic biography. But the most recent chapter before the Great Eruption had been quiet for centuries, perhaps 500 years or more. The island had settled into a period of deceptive peace, the kind of peace that makes people forget, that allows them to believe that disaster is something that happened to their ancestors, not something that might happen to them. Yet the magma chamber beneath Thera was far from empty or cooling. It was, in fact, approaching something like fullness. New magma had been entering it, bringing fresh heat and fresh gases, for decades. The temperature at the top of the magma body was around 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough that the rock above was beginning to shift and transform. Water seeping down from the surface was becoming superheated steam. The pressure, measured in bars and atmospheres, was climbing toward levels that no seal could contain indefinitely. The volcano was like a breath held far too long, like a heart beating faster and faster, like a tension wound tighter and tighter by an invisible hand. The gathering catastrophe was not sudden, it was inexorable. Around 1700 before the Common Era, the mountain beneath Thera had been stirring in ways that the island's inhabitants may have noticed, or perhaps dismissed as they went about their days. The earth trembled, springs ran hot, animals behaved strangely. But for generations the mountain had held, and so the people of Akrotiri, perched on the caldera's edge, built their homes taller, painted their walls with frescoes of women gathering saffron and children playing, and trusted in the continuity of their world. Then came the morning when that trust shattered. We cannot know the exact hour, though archaeologists and volcanologists have pieced together the outline of what unfolded across what may have been a single day, or stretched across several. The geological record suggests the eruption itself took place over hours of almost inconceivable violence. The initial event would have been a tremendous explosion, a sudden release of pressure that had built over years, decades perhaps. The magma chamber, vast and superheated beneath the island, burst open. The sound alone must have been felt across the entire Aegean, a roar that would have seemed to come from the Earth's very throat. Picture, if you can, the moment the ash began to rise, not gently, not in wispy clouds that drift on the wind, but in a column of searing material that climbs skyward with a terrible momentum. Pumice, ash, gases so hot they would ignite anything combustible in their path. Within minutes, the column would have climbed higher than any bird could fly, reaching into the upper atmosphere, casting a shadow across Crete itself. Though Crete lay some kilometers away across the sea, the sky, which moments before had been the clear blue of a Mediterranean morning, began to darken. On the island of Crete, in the great palaces of Knossos and Phaistos, people would have noticed the light changing, not all at once, but perceptibly, as if the sun were being swallowed by an approaching eclipse. The air would have grown cooler, and then, as the hours passed, the ash would have begun to fall, fine gray particles drifting down like the most unnatural snow, settling on skin, in hair, coating everything. Ash thicker and thicker, until it became difficult to see across a room. The darkness would have seemed total, and with the ash came the tremors, the terrible rolling movements of the ground beneath their feet. But this was only the first act of the volcano's fury. The collapse was what came next, and it may have been even more catastrophic than the eruption itself. As the magma chamber emptied, as the material was expelled upward and outward, the mountain lost its support. The summit, lacking the pressure from below that had held it aloft, began to sink. It was not a gradual subsidence, but a collapse. In mere moments, perhaps less than an hour, the upper portion of the volcano, thousands of meters of rock and stone, fell inward into the void below, creating a caldera, a vast depression where the mountain had stood. The island itself was fundamentally, irrevocably altered. And in the water surrounding Thera, the effects of this collapse were spreading in waves. The displacement of so much material, the sudden inward rush of water into the space where rock had been, created disturbances that propagated outward in all directions. These were not the gentle, rolling waves that lap at a beach on an ordinary day. These were tsunamis, waves of water driven by the force of the eruption itself, waves that in the open ocean might not have been tremendously high, but that contained within them an enormous amount of energy. As they traveled across the Aegean toward Crete, they would have moved at the speed of a fast-running person, outpacing any messenger, unstoppable. The northern coast of Crete would have been struck first. Towns and harbors on that side of the island would have experienced the wave as a sudden rise in water level, perhaps initially 2 or 3 meters, perhaps more. For a moment, the sea would have seemed to pause, as if taking a breath, and then it would have retreated, pulling the water away from the shore with a force that would have emptied harbors, exposed the seafloor, and created a deadly suction. Any ship in the harbor would have been lifted and broken, or dragged toward the open sea. Anything not firmly anchored to the land would have been swept away. Then came the return wave, perhaps even more violent than the first. The water came back, surging inland, smashing through buildings, uprooting trees, carrying boats and debris far inland. Settlements that had stood on the coast for generations were obliterated. The beaches themselves were redrawn. On the island of Thera, the settlement of Akrotiri, which had clung to the cliffs above the caldera, was buried almost instantly. The eruption column had descended upon it, or perhaps the collapse itself had destroyed it. We can only say that it was engulfed so rapidly and so completely that everything was frozen in ash, preserved in a tomb of pumice. Across the Aegean, the consequences rippled outward. The ash, drifting on the winds, would eventually fall across the entire eastern Mediterranean. In Egypt, Though thousands of kilometers away, ancient records suggest that a mysterious darkness fell at this time, though the connection is debated among scholars. Crops across the region would have failed from the ashfall and the cooling of the climate. The careful balance of Mediterranean civilization, built on agriculture and trade, was disrupted at a stroke. And yet, and this is perhaps the most sobering reflection, the eruption of Thera, catastrophic as it was, did not immediately end Minoan civilization. The palaces would be rebuilt, or at least reoccupied. Life would continue, though it would never quite be the same. But the catastrophe had set in motion a slow decline. The great thalassocracy that had ruled the waves of the Bronze Age Mediterranean began a gradual loss of power. The Mycenaean Greeks, powerful and ambitious on the mainland, began to fill the spaces left by Minoan weakness. The world was changing, irrevocably, and the volcano beneath Thera had struck the first blow in that transformation. The island itself, after the eruption, was barely recognizable. Where there had been a mountain, there was now a vast depression of water, a caldera so deep that it reached far below sea level. The outer walls of what remained of the island would slowly crumble over the coming centuries as the sea eroded them, and in the center of that depression, slowly, patiently, over many decades and centuries, a new island would begin to form, as volcanic activity continued beneath the sea. Eventually, new peaks would rise above the water's surface, and the process of creation and destruction would continue, as it does everywhere on this restless planet. In the days that followed the eruption, as the ash slowly settled across the Aegean like a gray snow, the world that had existed before Thera's collapse began to dissolve. Not all at once. Catastrophe, when it arrives at the scale of geological violence, moves through human societies like water through cracks, seeping, spreading, reshaping the very foundation upon which everything else had been built. The Minoans did not simply vanish. Instead, they were transformed. Their islands, their cities, their networks of trade and influence experienced a slow unraveling that would take centuries to complete, and in that unraveling, we glimpse something both terrible and instructive about how even the greatest civilizations can lose their way. The immediate effects were severe. Akrotiri, that sister city on Thera, was buried entirely and sealed beneath volcanic stone and pumice, a tragedy complete and final. But on Crete itself, the destruction, while severe, was not total. The great palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea were damaged but not obliterated. Yet something more insidious than physical damage had been done. The carefully maintained networks of trade that had made Minoan civilization prosperous began to fracture. The Nile Delta harbors where Cretan merchants had established themselves grew unstable. The islands of the Aegean, where Minoan goods had flowed for centuries, were themselves choked with ash and disrupted. The thalassocracy, that sea power that had defined Minoan identity, suddenly found the seas far more treacherous. Ships that had once sailed with confidence began to disappear. The predictable rhythms of commerce and exchange that had allowed Crete to prosper began to stutter and fail. In the aftermath, something else was happening on the mainland. The Mycenaeans, those warrior princes of the Greek mainland whose palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns had long existed in a kind of cautious coexistence with Minoan power, began to move. Whether the eruption itself weakened Minoan defenses so completely that opportunism became possible, or whether the Mycenaean expansion had already been gathering momentum and the catastrophe simply accelerated an inevitable shift, remains a question that scholars gently debate. What we can say is this: the balance of power in the Aegean, which had tilted so heavily toward Crete for so long, began its slow pivot toward the mainland. The Mycenaeans were different in character from the Minoans. Where Minoan society had been relatively peaceful, organized around merchant princes and elaborate trade networks, the Mycenaean world was consciously martial. Their palaces were fortified. Their art was filled with hunting scenes and warfare. Their values emphasized the prowess of heroes and the glory of individual warriors. Yet they had not emerged from nothing. For centuries, Mycenaean elites had been absorbing Minoan culture, hiring Minoan artists, commissioning Minoan goods, sending their sons to be educated in Cretan ways. The boundary between the two worlds had been porous, permeable. And now, as Minoan power weakened, that cultural admiration began to shade into something else, something closer to replacement. We see evidence of this transformation in the archaeological record, scattered across the remains of Cretan settlements in the centuries following the eruption. In some places, pottery styles shift. Where once the graceful, flowing designs characteristic of Minoan art had dominated, we begin to see the stiffer, more geometric patterns favored by the Mycenaeans. In other places, we find traces of destruction that may represent conflict, though here the evidence becomes ambiguous, and we must be cautious about our interpretations. Did Mycenaean raiders destroy these settlements, or were they destroyed by the chaos and instability that followed the eruption itself? The bones themselves do not always speak with perfect clarity. What becomes clear is this. Over the course of roughly 2 centuries, from the eruption around 1450 BCE to the final collapse of the palace-centered system around 1100 BCE, Minoan civilization as it had been known gradually faded. The great palaces, though they were rebuilt and reoccupied after the eruption, never again achieved their former glory. They were maintained, reused, but their purpose seemed to shift. Where once they had been centers of economic administration and religious life for the entire island, increasingly they became fortified strongholds, adapted to a more martial, defensive mentality. And then there was the script. To understand what happened to Minoan identity in this period, one must understand the written word. The Linear A script, that still undeciphered system of writing that had served the Minoan administration for centuries, continued to be used for a time in the post-eruption period. But its days were numbered. The Mycenaeans, who had adopted and adapted their own writing system from Minoan models, had created what we now call Linear B, a syllabic script specifically designed to write the Greek language. It was not simply a different way of writing the same words. It was a different language altogether. It represented the assertion of Mycenaean political authority, Mycenaean administration, Mycenaean identity. What is remarkable about Linear B is that we can actually read it. Unlike Linear A, which remains one of archaeology's great unsolved puzzles, Linear B was deciphered in the 1950s by a brilliant English architect named Michael Ventris, and what he discovered was transformative. The tablets written in Linear B told of inventories, of rations, of administrative decisions made in a distinctly Greek idiom. This was not the language of the Minoan traders and seafarers. This was the language of the Greek people who would, in centuries to come, create the classical civilization we know from Homer and Herodotus. So the shift from Linear A to Linear B represents something profound. It was not merely a change in writing system, it was the inscription, quite literally, of cultural dominance. As Linear B spread and Linear A fell into disuse, the Minoan system of administration, whatever its structure, whatever its logic, was replaced by a Mycenaean one. The priestesses who had once kept the records in the old script were displaced or absorbed. The merchants who had relied on Linear A documents found themselves dealing with a new bureaucracy, new rules, new power structures. This transition was not instantaneous. In the decades immediately following the eruption, both scripts may have coexisted. Crete remained Cretan. The island retained much of its distinctive character, but the underlying currents of power were shifting, and those currents would eventually carry away the last vestiges of the old world. Consider, as we drift through this period, what it might have felt like to witness such a transformation. A merchant in Knossos, watching the great palace being rebuilt, might have believed that the old order would persist. A priestess tending the sacred caves might have maintained the rituals, the goddess worship, the ceremonies that had defined her people's spiritual life for centuries. Yet decade by decade, almost imperceptibly, the world around them was changing. New people were arriving from the mainland. New dialects were being spoken. The scripts on the administrative tablets were becoming foreign. The ships that called at Cretan harbors carried Mycenaean goods alongside the remnants of Minoan trade. There is something melancholy in contemplating such transitions. Not tragic necessarily, the lives of ordinary Cretans likely continued much as they had before. The farmers still planted their olives and their grapes, the women still gathered in homes to weave, children still played in the same streets under the same sun. Yet something irreplaceable was passing away. A distinctive way of being, a particular constellation of values and practices that had made Crete what it was dissolving into something else. The great civilization that had sent its merchants and its artists across the known world was becoming instead a province of a new power. That is the melancholy of what historians call cultural replacement, not annihilation, but integration into a larger order. The Minoans did not disappear. Rather, they became Mycenaean, and then they became Greek. By around 1100 BCE, the Linear B tablets also cease. The palace system that had produced them collapses. This is the event that marks the end of the Bronze Age in the Aegean, and it corresponds to a period of upheaval throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. Invasions, climate disruption, the mysterious sea peoples, widespread social collapse. But before that final collapse, there had already been a long, slow fading of Minoan identity. The civilization that had flourished for over 1,000 years, that had created art and beauty and networks of trade that reached from Egypt to the Hittite kingdoms, had already given way. What emerges from the ashes of this period is not the same world that came before. Instead, there is a new synthesis, a world where Mycenaean power structures, Greek language, and Greek values increasingly dominate, but where the deep heritage of Minoan culture persists in transformed ways. The goddess worship that had been so central to Minoan religion would echo forward into Greek religion, though now subordinated to the male-dominated Olympian pantheon. The sophisticated maritime networks would continue, but under new masters. The artistic traditions would evolve, taking elements of the Minoan sensibility forward into the geometric and archaic periods. In this sense, the Minoans were not so much erased as absorbed, transformed, woven into the larger tapestry of what would become ancient Greek civilization. And yet, the question lingers in the mind. Would they have recognized themselves in what came after? Would a priestess of the goddess have found meaning in the new religious structures? Would a merchant accustomed to the free exchange of Minoan ports have accepted the more rigid hierarchies of Mycenaean administration? We cannot know. History does not often grant us such certainty. But we can know this, that for 1,000 years, a remarkable civilization had existed, and in the span of a few centuries, it had transformed into something else. The volcano, then, had not merely destroyed Akrotiri, it had set in motion forces that would reshape the entire Aegean world, ending an age and beginning another. The stone beneath the earth had spoken, and the course of history had shifted. For more than 3,000 years, the palaces of Crete lay buried beneath olive groves and limestone, their painted walls invisible to the world, their script unread, their stories compressed into myth and shadow. The Minoans had become a whisper, a half-remembered echo in the tales that Homer and later Greek writers had woven into legend. And then, as the 19th century drew toward its close, a single man arrived on the island with a conviction that would transform archaeology itself, the belief that the myths were not merely invention, but memory. Arthur Evans was a British archaeologist and collector with independent means, an eye trained by years of study and travel, and a certainty that gleamed with both brilliance and, as some would later suggest, a touch of romanticism. In 1900, at the age of 50, he began to excavate a low rise near the village of Knossos, in the central heart of Crete. What he uncovered would not only restore a lost civilization to the historical record, but would also teach the world something profound about the way we reconstruct the past, about the line between faithful restoration and imaginative remaking. The first weeks of digging revealed fragments so arresting that Evans knew at once he had found something extraordinary. Walls emerged bearing traces of brilliant frescoes, pottery of a sophistication and artistry that rivaled anything from the classical Greek world came away in careful handfuls. Storage vessels of colossal size suggested wealth and planning on a scale that contradicted the idea that the ancient Aegean had been a periphery of civilization. And everywhere, in the masonry itself, in the arrangement of rooms, in the intricate systems of drainage and ventilation, there rose the evidence of a culture of considerable refinement and technical knowledge. Evans worked with passion, employing large teams of local workers and bringing in specialists to document, sketch, and preserve what emerged day by day. The palace complex grew beneath the Cretan earth, like something being remembered rather than discovered. Its layout astonished him, not a fortress, as the great palaces of the mainland kingdoms were, but an open, labyrinthine structure arranged around a central court, decorated with gardens and light wells, a building that spoke of a society confident enough in its security that it had no need for defensive walls. The art on its walls sang with a kind of joyful naturalism, utterly different from the more formal, heraldic styles of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Over the decades, for Evans would continue to excavate and study Knossos until the late 1920s. Returning to the work even in his advanced age, the palace revealed room after room of marvels. The throne room emerged, with its alabaster seats still standing, flanked by reconstructed frescoes of great seated griffins. The queen's chamber was found, decorated with dolphins and flowering plants. Storage chambers yielded thousands of vessels marked with signs that Evans recognized as a written script unlike any known form. He termed it Linear A language that would remain stubbornly resistant to decipherment even after his death. But Evans did something that would become, in hindsight, both his greatest gift to archaeology and a source of considerable controversy. He did not merely excavate, he reconstructed. Where walls had fallen, he raised them again. Where frescoes survived only as fragments, he commissioned artists to complete them, guided by his interpretation of what would have been there. Where rooms had been emptied by time and disaster, he furnished them in ways he believed would have been authentic to Minoan life. The palace that visitors walked through in the early 20th century was thus a hybrid creation, part genuine artifact, part Evans's vision of what the Minoans might have been. This impulse came from a place of genuine scholarly desire to help people understand the past more vividly, to step into the world as it had lived, rather than to see only ruins and fragments. But it also meant that Knossos, as it stands today, carries within it the fingerprints of a man and an era, the aesthetic choices of the early 1900s, superimposed upon the remains of the Bronze Age. Some of his restorations have held up well under the scrutiny of later archaeologists. Others have been questioned, revised, or partially dismantled as new understandings of Minoan architecture and craft have emerged. The effect of Evans's work was nevertheless electrifying. The Minoans ceased to be the ghosts of mythology and became a historical people. Newspapers carried reports of the excavations. Scholars from across Europe came to study the site. The palace was photographed, drawn, measured, and interpreted in ways that captured the imagination of the learned world. Evans himself became something of a celebrity in archaeological circles, his books and lectures carrying the story of Crete back to universities and museums and drawing rooms where ancient history was discussed with fascination. What Evans had found seemed to vindicate the Greek legends in unexpected ways. Here was a civilization, demonstrably real, that had flourished in the Aegean in an age before the classical Greeks. It had been wealthy, cultured, and connected to the wider Mediterranean world. Its artistic vision had been bold and distinctive, and it had come to a sudden end, a fact that only deepened the mystery of its collapse and made the Minoan story feel like a chapter in the Earth's own memory, a record written not in books but in ash and pottery and faded paint. As the 20th century progressed, other sites on Crete were excavated. Phaistos, Malea, and Akrotiri on the nearby island of Thera. Each discovery added texture and detail to the picture Evans had begun to restore. Each new excavation also brought new questions about the reliability of earlier reconstructions and the ways in which our own assumptions shape what we see when we look at the remains of the past. Yet Evans's legacy remains profound. He had demonstrated that archaeology was not merely a matter of careful digging and cataloging, but a form of storytelling, a dialogue between the present and the past, in which we ask questions that resonate with our own time. He had shown that the dead could still speak if we listened with patience and imagination, and he had given back to the world a civilization that might otherwise have remained a footnote in ancient history, a phantom civilization conjured from myths that no one quite believed anymore. The palace at Knossos stands still, its reconstructed walls vivid in the Mediterranean sun, its throne room waiting for visitors who come to walk its corridors and try to imagine the footsteps of queens and priestesses and merchants who passed through those same halls when the world was younger and the island of Crete was the center of a maritime realm whose reach extended across the known seas. The stone pillars still stand in the courtyards of Knossos, and the frescoes still glow with their impossible blues and saffron yellows, bearing witness to a people who flourished, created, and then nearly vanished from the living world entirely. What remains of the Minoans is less a complete story than a collection of half-remembered moments, fragments of grandeur frozen in ash and sediment, waiting for us to lean close and listen to what they are still trying to tell us across 3,500 years of silence and time. Perhaps the most profound lesson the Minoans offer is not what they built or how they traded, or the skill of their artists' hands, but rather something quieter and more difficult to articulate, the reminder that all things, no matter how magnificent, are temporary. They did not know that morning, when Thera trembled and the sky began to darken, that their world was ending. They had no warning grand enough, no prophecy clear enough, to prepare them for the moment when stone became powder and the sea itself rose up to erase their harbors. They had believed, as all people do, in the continuity of tomorrow. Yet what is striking, what settles into the mind like sediment itself, is that they are not truly gone. The Minoans persist not as skeletal remains or pottery shards, though those tell their stories too, but as an echo in the consciousness of later peoples who remembered them and transformed memory into myth. The Greeks who came after, the Mycenaeans and their descendants, carried forward the memory of a sophisticated civilization that had preceded them, and they wove it into their own narratives. The labyrinth and the minotaur, those enduring symbols of mystery and danger, emerged from the fragmentary recollection of the palace complexes and the religious rituals of Crete. The legend of King Minos, half real and half invention, kept the Minoans alive in story, even as their actual history faded from direct knowledge. And what they whisper across the ages concerns not their fall, but their lives. When we look at the fresco of the blue dolphins leaping through water, we are seeing the joy of an artist who wanted to capture the very essence of motion and pleasure. When we observe the careful arrangement of storage jars in the palace magazines, we witness the painstaking administration of abundance, the desire to manage prosperity with order and care. When we study the small terracotta figurines of women, with their arms raised in what we interpret as gesture of prayer or invocation, we glimpse the spiritual yearning of ordinary people seeking connection with something greater than themselves. These are not the remains of a fallen civilization mourning its fate. They are snapshots of vitality, of engagement with the material and sacred worlds, of the simple human wish to make something beautiful or meaningful before time moves on. The Minoans understood, perhaps better than we often credit them, the relationship between permanence and change. Their palaces were destroyed multiple times throughout their history, and each time they rebuilt them, each time they reconstructed their vision of order and beauty, aware perhaps that nothing they created would last forever. They lived on an island shaped by volcanic activity, by the constant geological forces that remake the earth. They sailed the unpredictable sea, dependent on winds and currents that cared nothing for human plans or desires. And yet they chose to create elaborate spaces for gathering, to commission artists to decorate their walls with images of nature and grace, to invest in trade networks and systems of administration that required a leap of faith that tomorrow would come. There is a peculiar kind of courage in that choice. Not the courage of warriors or heroes, though the Minoans surely had that too, but the courage of ordinary builders and administrators and artists, who decided that the making and the doing and the creating were worth doing even in the full knowledge, conscious or unconscious, that nothing lasts. The very fact that we can sit here in the quiet dark of the night and know about the Minoans, can visualize their streets and imagine their voices, and feel the weight of their ambitions and dreams, is itself a kind of defiance against impermanence. In the end, perhaps the deepest message the Minoans offer us is not a warning, though the eruption of Thera carries lesson enough about the power of nature and the fragility of human settlement. It is, instead, an invitation to recognize what truly endures. They are gone, yes. Their alphabet remains largely unread, their language silenced, their way of life scattered into history. But the fact that they strove, that they created, that they looked at the world around them and saw fit to render it beautiful in pigment and clay and stone, this persists. This touches something in us that recognizes itself across the centuries. When the archaeologist Arthur Evans stood in the ruined courtyards of Knossos in the early 1900s, and began the work of excavation and reconstruction, he was not simply uncovering the past, he was participating in one of the most human of all activities, the act of remembrance, the refusal to let absence be absolute. And every visitor who has since walked those reconstructed corridors, has stood before those frescoes, and felt the presence of the hands that made them, has engaged in that same quiet act of witness and acknowledgement. The Minoans whisper to us, perhaps, that we too are temporary, that the cities we build and the things we make and the art we create will outlast us only if others choose to remember, to seek it out, to give it meaning. And that makes it all the more important to create with care, to live with intention, to understand that the value of what we do lies not in its permanence, but in the fact that we do it at all, that we gather together in spaces we have made, that we adorn our surroundings with color and grace, that we connect with one another across distance through trade and story, and the simple human need to be seen and understood. So the Minoans sleep beneath the earth and sea, and their bronze vessels and pottery and stone tools rest in museums around the world, cared for by people who understand their worth. Their memory lives in the stories we tell, in the images we preserve, in the questions we continue to ask about who they were and how they lived. And perhaps, in the quiet hours before sleep takes us, there is something restorative in that knowledge, that civilizations rise and fall like waves, that everything transforms, and that the traces we leave behind carry meaning long after we ourselves have gone. The world has been shaped by countless peoples, countless hands and minds and hearts, and we are part of that continuity. Like the Minoans, we too are making our mark, even as time moves on,